The Inbred brothers who kept their three sisters chained in the attic, the Kentucky breeding cabin discovered. 1890. Black Mars Holler, Eastern Kentucky. A census taker glimpses a pale face in a high window. Four brothers who speak as one. A cabin that reeks of lie and silence. Then iron bolts on a door that opens from the outside only. Inside, 3 women, 11 twisted children, and a leather-bound book that charts 6 generations of blood folding back on itself, a family tree that loops inward like a noose. The eldest sister kept count on the attic wall, thousands of marks scratched in the dark. Her testimony would later reveal the cold, scheduled horror her own parents designed. This is how their secret finally surfaced, through a charred page, a census report, and a justice who refused to look away. The brothers were tried. 2 swung from the gallows. But before the rope tightened, the eldest stood in court and spoke the words that no one could unhear. So who burns the evidence when the law is done? And does fire truly cleanse what isolation protected for so long? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and if you're brave enough for this journey. Subscribe so you don't miss stories that reveal the darkest corners of human nature. The year is 1890. The fog in eastern Kentucky does not lift. It settles like a judgment, thick and cold, turning the valleys into wells of white silence. In the cramped office of Circuit Justice Elias Thorne, a single document waits on a desk, cluttered with land deeds and tax disputes. It is a census report, handwritten in the careful script of a young man named Abel Fry. And it should not be remarkable. But Thorne, a methodical former clerk from Lexington, who believes truth lives in the margins of official records, has read it 3 times now, and each time the unease grows sharper. The report describes a property in Black Mars Holler, a remote valley so isolated that even the traveling preachers avoid it after dark. 4 brothers, the Rodenbecks, had refused Fry entry to their cabin, standing shoulder to shoulder in the doorway like a wall of flesh. They gave names when pressed: Silas, Malachi, Hezekiah, Jubal, but their eyes, Fry wrote, were cold and empty, and they spoke in turns as if rehearsed. The census taker noted he could not verify the number of occupants, a failure that gnawed at his professional pride. Then came the detail that made Thorne mark the file with a red X. Fry had glimpsed for just a moment a pale and haunted face in a high attic window before one of the brothers stepped forward and blocked his view entirely. Thorne pulls a second document from his drawer, a mercantile ledger borrowed from the general store in the nearest settlement. The Rodenbecks trade there twice a year, always in autumn, always silent. They sell hand-carved goods and produce so perfect it seems unnatural. Apples without blemish, turnips the size of a child's head. The store owner, a man named Jessup, had noted in his own hand that the brothers never brought womenfolk, never mentioned family, and flinched visibly when a customer's infant cried near the counter. But it is the quantities that trouble Thorne now. Over the past 5 years, the Rodenbecks purchased lye, in amounts far exceeding any farming need, enough to strip a body to bone or scrub a floor until it bled white. They bought iron polish, lamp oil, and bolts, heavy iron bolts, the kind used to secure livestock or seal a root cellar against wolves. No wolves live in Black Mars Holler anymore. Everyone knows this. Thorne lights a lamp as the autumn dusk thickens outside his window. He opens a thin folder containing a single testimonial, unsigned, but dated from the previous year. A traveling preacher passing through the region had attempted to visit the Rodenbeck cabin to offer spiritual counsel. The brothers had met him on the porch, swept clean as a church floor, and refused him entry with a politeness that felt like a threat. The preacher later told his wife, in words she recorded and sent to the county clerk, that he felt a godless chill emanating from that house, a wrongness that had nothing to do with weather. He described the brothers as moving in unison, their gestures mirrored, their voices flat and rehearsed, as though they were not four men, but a single creature wearing four faces. He never returned to that hollow, and he warned others in his congregation to avoid it as well. Thorn spreads the three documents before him like cards in a grim hand of fate: a census refusal, excessive purchases of lye and iron, a preacher turned away by men who moved as one, and somewhere in that cabin, a pale face in an attic window, gone before it could be confirmed. These are not crimes, not yet, but they are gaps in the record, silences where there should be answers. Thorn has spent his career believing that evil, when it exists, leaves a trail, a receipt, a witness, a page torn and discarded. He runs his finger along the edge of Fry's report, pausing at the description of the brothers' cold uniform stare. The law does not act on unease, but Thorn has learned that unease is often truth, waiting to be proven. He writes a single line in his personal case log: the ink dark and deliberate, Rodenbeck family, Blackmare's Holler, marked for personal review, suspected concealment of occupants, evidence of isolation and evasion, truth believed, deliberately hidden. Thorn closes the file and places it atop the others, but he does not file it away. Instead, he leaves it on his desk, visible, insistent. He will ride to Blackmare's Holler himself under the pretext of a land survey dispute, and he will find the truth that four brothers are keeping locked behind iron bolts. The fog outside his window thickens, but Thorn lights a second lamp. He is a man of paper and ink, and he knows that somewhere in that hollow a record is waiting to be read, a record written in chains, in silence, and in the pale, haunted face of someone who has been erased from the ledger of the living. Just as Thorn rides toward Blackmare's Holler on a cold November morning, the fog so thick his horse moves through it like a ship through milk. He carries with him a leather satchel containing a surveyor's map, a land dispute claim he invented himself, and a small notebook bound in brown cloth where he will record everything he observes. The pretext is simple: a boundary disagreement between the Rodenbecks and a neighboring property owner who does not exist. Thorn knows the brothers will not verify this. Men who hide do not ask questions that invite scrutiny. The trail narrows as he descends into the hollow, the trees pressing close, their branches skeletal and dripping. No birds sing here. The silence is absolute, broken only by the muffled sound of his horse's hooves on the soft earth. The Rodenbeck cabin emerges from the fog like a wound in the landscape. It is larger than Thorn expected. 2 stories of dark timber with a steep roof and a single stone chimney. The porch is swept clean, unnaturally so, as though someone scrubs it daily with the same lye they buy in bulk from Jessop's store. Thorn dismounts and ties his horse to a post that has been worn smooth by decades of use. Before he can knock, the door opens. All 4 brothers stand in the doorway, shoulder to shoulder, exactly as Abel Fry described. They do not greet him. They do not smile. Silas, the eldest, steps forward first, his face gaunt and expressionless, his eyes the color of dirty ice. He asks Thorn his business in a voice that is flat and careful, each word measured as though it has been rehearsed 1,000 times. Thorn explains the land dispute, unfolding the surveyor's map with deliberate slowness. He watches their faces for any flicker of confusion or concern, but there is nothing. Malachi nods once. Hezekiah folds his arms. Jubal remains perfectly still. Silas takes the map and studies it without blinking, then hands it back and begins to recite their property boundaries from memory. His words precise and practiced. Thorn listens, taking notes, but his eyes are scanning the porch, the windows, the edges of the clearing. Everything is too clean. There are no toys in the yard, no wash hanging on a line, no signs of women or children, despite the census record listing occupants. The only sound is the faint creak of the porch boards beneath their feet and the low hum of wind through the hollow. As Silas speaks, Thorn's gaze drifts to a fire pit near the side of the cabin. The ground around it is blackened and raked smooth, but something white catches his eye. A corner of paper half buried in the ash. He interrupts Silas with a question about water rights, a distraction, and as the brothers turn to point toward a distant creek, Thorn takes 2 steps closer to the fire pit. The paper is brittle and charred along the edges, but part of it remains intact. He can see lines, circles, names written in a cramped, archaic hand. He does not touch it yet. He does not need to. He knows what it is. The brothers finish their explanation and turn back to him in unison. Their movements synchronized in a way that makes Thorn's skin crawl. He thanks them, folds his map, and asks if they require any further assistance from the county. Silas says they do not. He says they are self-sufficient, God-fearing men who keep to themselves and ask nothing of the world. Beyond their hollow. His tone is pious, almost serene, but his eyes never leave Thorn's face. The other brothers say nothing. They simply stand there breathing in rhythm, watching. Thorn nods, tips his hat, and walks back to his horse. He does not look at the fire pit again, but as he mounts and turns his horse toward the trail, he lets his boot drag slightly, scuffing ash and dirt over the exposed corner of paper so it will not blow away before he can return. That night in his office, Thorn rides back under the cover of dusk with a single deputy he trusts, a man named Callum, who asks no questions. They approach the fire pit on foot, moving in silence. Thorn kneels and uses a thin blade to lift the charred page from the ash. It tears slightly, but enough remains. He carries it back to his office wrapped in oilcloth, and under the light of 3 lamps, he and Callum flatten it on his desk. It is a family tree, hand-drawn, the ink faded but legible. At the top are 2 names, Jedediah and Azuba Rodenbeck. Below them, connected by a single line, are their children, 4 sons, 3 daughters. But the lines do not stop there. They loop downward and then back inward, connecting brothers to sisters in a web of ink that makes Thorn's hands shake. Each pairing is marked with a date and a symbol he does not recognize, but the meaning is unmistakable. This is not a family tree. It is a map of deliberate generational incest, a blueprint of sin carried out with the precision of holy ritual. Callum, a man who has seen death and violence in these mountains, steps back from the desk and crosses himself. Thorn does not move. He stares at the page, at the names of the 3 sisters, Tamar, Oilia, Elspeth, and the lines that bind them to their brothers. He counts 6 generations, each one folding back into itself like a serpent eating its own tail. This is not a crime of passion or madness. This is a system inherited and sustained, recorded and protected. Thorn writes a single sentence in his case log, his handwriting sharp and furious. Evidence of premeditated multi-generational incest. Warrant required immediately. Rescue operation, not investigation. He knows now that the pale face in the attic window was not a ghost. It was a prisoner. And somewhere in that cabin, behind iron bolts and a wall of silence, the truth is waiting to be unbolted. 3 weeks pass before Thorn secures his warrant. 3 weeks during which he does not sleep well and cannot stop seeing the looping lines of that charred family tree. The county judge, a man named Whitfield, who has presided over these mountain districts for 20 years, reads the evidence twice before signing his name. He writes in the margin of the warrant in handwriting that trembles slightly that this is the first case in his career where he fears what the law will find more than what it will fail to find. Thorn rides back to Black Mars Holler on a grey December morning with Deputy Callum, a man whose silence is worth more than most men's words. They bring no additional officers, no crowd. Thorn knows that whatever waits in that cabin will require witnesses of steady nerve, not numbers. The fog is thinner today, and as they approach the property, Thorn can see 2 of the brothers working near a fence line at the edge of the clearing. Hezekiah and Jubal. They do not look up as the horses approach, but their hands stop moving, and Thorn knows they have been heard. Thorn dismounts and walks forward, the warrant folded in his coat pocket. He calls out to the brothers by name, his voice carrying across the cold air. They turn in unison, their faces blank, their eyes registering neither surprise nor fear. Thorn states his purpose clearly, holding up the warrant so they can see the judge's seal. He tells them he is here under the authority of the county court to inspect the premises and verify the occupants of the household. Hezekiah wipes his hands on his trousers. Slowly, deliberately, Jubal tilts his head slightly, as though listening to a voice only he can hear. Then Hezekiah speaks, his voice low and steady, and says they do not consent to entry. Thorn expected this. He unfolds the warrant and reads aloud the legal language that makes their consent irrelevant. The brothers do not move. They do not argue. They simply stand there watching as Thorn and Callum walk past them toward the cabin door. The door is unlocked. Thorn pushes it open and steps inside. Callum close behind. The smell hits them immediately. Lie so strong it burns the back of the throat mixed with something else, something faint and sour that Thorn cannot name. The main floor of the cabin is a study in unnatural order. The wooden table is scrubbed white. The floor planks gleam as though polished daily. There are no personal items, no scattered clothing, no books or papers. The hearth is cold and spotless. Thorn walks slowly through the room, opening cabinets, checking corners. There are provisions, sacks of cornmeal, jars of preserved vegetables, smoked meat hanging from hooks, but no signs of women or children, no dresses, no small shoes, no toys or cradles, or anything that would suggest life beyond the four brothers. The silence inside the cabin is heavier than the silence outside, a silence that presses against the ears like water. Callum moves toward the back of the room, his boots creaking on the floorboards, and then he stops. He is looking up. Thorn follows his gaze and sees it. Dark stains on the ceiling boards, spreading out in uneven circles like oil seeping through wood. The stains are old, layered, the kind that come from years of dampness or something worse. Directly above them is a narrow door built into the ceiling itself, a hatch with a frame of iron. Thorn steps closer and sees what makes his blood go cold. 3 heavy iron bolts, each as thick as a man's thumb, are driven through the frame from the outside. There is no handle on this side of the door, no way to open it from above. This door is not meant to keep something out. It is meant to keep something in. Callum looks at Thorn, his face pale, and asks in a voice barely above a whisper if they should call for more men. Thorn shakes his head. He cannot wait. He cannot leave and return tomorrow, knowing what those bolts mean. He draws his revolver, not because he expects violence, but because his hands need something to hold, and he nods to Callum. The deputy steps forward, sets the butt of his rifle against the first bolt, and slams it hard. The sound is a thunderclap in the silent cabin, echoing off the walls. The bolt slides free with a grinding screech of metal on metal. Callum moves to the second bolt, strikes it, and it gives way. The third bolt is rusted and takes 2 blows, the noise reverberating through the floor and up into the rafters. As the final bolt slides free, a wave of air rushes down from the darkness above. Air that is thick and foul, reeking of human waste and sickness and despair so profound it seems to have a smell of its own. Thorn steps back, his hand over his mouth, his eyes watering. Callum gags and turns his head, but he does not leave. From the blackness above the open hatch there is a sound, faint, fragile, barely human. It is a whimper, the sound of something that has learned not to make noise, that has been punished for breath itself. Thorn forces himself forward, gripping the edge of the hatch frame, and calls up into the darkness. He says he is an officer of the law. He says they are here to help. There is no response, only that same faint trembling whimper, and then another sound, a shuffling, a scraping, as though something is moving in the dark, but does not know how to approach the light. Callum strikes a match and holds it up. the small flame illuminating the edges of a ladder leading upward into the attic. Thorn climbs first, his revolver in one hand, the other gripping the ladder rungs. The smell grows stronger with each step, and when his head rises, above the floor of the attic he sees them, 3 women, skeletal and pale as ghosts, blinking in the sudden intrusion of light. Their wrists bear the deep scarred grooves of old restraints. Behind them, huddled in the corners of the attic like broken dolls, are children, 11 of them, their bodies twisted, their eyes wide and uncomprehending. The horror is no longer hidden. It is present, undeniable, and staring back at him with the weight of decades. Thorn does not speak. He cannot. He simply holds out his hand, and the eldest woman, her hair grey and matted, reaches toward him with fingers that shake like leaves in a storm. The attic is a tomb for the living. Thorn's eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through cracks in the roof boards, and the full scope of the horror becomes visible in pieces, each detail more damning than the last. The 3 women sit on thin pallets of straw, their bodies so emaciated that their bones press against their skin like tent poles. Their hair hangs in matted ropes, unwashed for what must be months or years. The eldest, her face lined with suffering that makes her look ancient, though she cannot be more than 40, watches Thorn with eyes that hold no hope, only a dull recognition that something has changed. Behind her, bolted directly into the oak floorboards, are 3 sets of iron chains, each ending in worn leather cuffs, darkened with old blood and sweat. The chains are long enough to allow movement across perhaps 10 ft of space, but no farther. Long enough to reach a slop bucket in the corner. Long enough to tend to the children who cower in the shadows, not long enough to reach the bolted door. Callum climbs up behind Thorn, his breathing shallow and rapid. He carries a lantern now, and as he raises it, the light reveals the walls. One entire section of the attic is covered in thousands upon thousands of faint scratches. Tally marks carved into the wood with something sharp. A nail, perhaps, or a shard of metal. The marks are grouped in sets of 5, the way prisoners count days, and they stretch from floor to ceiling in columns that speak of years, decades, a lifetime measured in scratches. Thorn steps closer, his hand trembling as he touches the wood. The marks are worn smooth in places, as though someone has run their fingers over them again and again, counting and recounting the days of their captivity. He estimates roughly that there are more than 10,000 marks on this wall alone. 10,000 days. That is 27 years. The eldest woman has been here since she was a girl. Thorn turns back to the women and kneels slowly, keeping his movements gentle and deliberate. He tells them his name. He tells them they are safe now, though the words feel hollow in this place where safety has never existed. The eldest woman does not speak, but one of the younger ones, her face gaunt and her eyes unfocused, whispers something so softly Thorn has to lean closer to hear. She says, "It is Tuesday." Thorn does not understand at first, but then the eldest woman speaks, her voice cracked and raw from disuse. She says the brothers keep a schedule. She says Tuesday is her day. She says her brothers are punctual men. The words land like stones in Thorn's chest, and he realizes with a sickening clarity that this is not chaos or madness. This is a system organized and maintained with the cold efficiency of men who believe they are doing holy work. Callum has moved to the far corner of the attic, where a large cedar chest sits beneath a narrow window. He calls to Thorn, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. Inside the chest, wrapped in oilcloth, is a book. A massive leather-bound ledger, its spine cracked from use, its pages filled with dense, meticulous handwriting. Thorn lifts it carefully and opens it to the first page. The title, written in an archaic script, reads, "The Blood Reckoning, a record of the Rodenbeck line, begun in the year of our Lord, 1832. What follows is not merely genealogy, it is a manifesto. Page after page details the family's sacred duty as they see it to preserve their bloodline by keeping it pure, untouched by the corruption of outsiders. The term used repeatedly is folding the blood back upon itself, and it is described with a religious fervor that makes Thorne's hands shake. Each birth is recorded with the names of both parents, always siblings, always Rodenbecks. Each child is marked as either pure stock or flawed, the latter crossed out with a single line of ink that Thorne understands to mean death. The ledger contains 6 generations of this practice, beginning with Jedediah and Azuba, who the text claims received a divine vision, instructing them to withdraw from the world and maintain the purity of their line. Their children continued the practice, their grandchildren refined it, and the current generation, the 4 brothers and 3 sisters, have carried it forward with the cold precision of men who believe they are stewards of a holy covenant. Thorne finds entries for each of the 11 surviving children in the attic, their births recorded with clinical detail, dates, times, physical descriptions, and notations about their development. The children who did not survive are listed in a separate column, their names followed by ages of death ranging from a few days to several years. 22 children born, 11 survived. The numbers are written without emotion, without regret, as though documenting livestock. While Thorne reads, Callum has brought the women and children down from the attic one by one, moving them outside into the cold December air, where they blink in the daylight like creatures emerging from a cave. 2 of the brothers, Hezekiah and Jubal, have been placed in irons and sit silent on the porch, their faces showing neither shame nor anger, only a patient waiting. Silas and Malachi arrive from the fields and are taken into custody without resistance. They do not ask why. They do not protest. Silas simply looks at Thorne and says they have done nothing wrong, that they have followed the law given to them by their blood and their God. His voice is calm, measured, and utterly devoid of human feeling. Thorne sends Callum to ride for the county physician, Dr. Abram Galloway, a man of science and reputation who will provide the medical evidence the court will require. While they wait, Thorne continues documenting everything, the chains, the tally marks, the ledger, the conditions of the attic. He takes measurements, he makes sketches, he collects the iron cuffs and places them in a canvas sack, noting the dried blood still visible in the leather. When Dr. Galloway arrives 3 hours later, he spends the remainder of the day examining the women and children, his face growing more grim with each passing hour. That evening, by lamplight, he begins writing his report. It will run 12 pages and become the prosecution's most devastating exhibit. In clinical, unflinching language, he documents ligature scars, malnutrition, evidence of repeated trauma, and the severe congenital deformities present in every one of the 11 children. Deformities, he writes, that are the unmistakable signature of generational inbreeding. He titles the final section of his report A Catalogue of Generational Damnation, and he signs his name with a hand that does not waver. The evidence is complete. The case against the Rodenbeck brothers is not a matter of belief or testimony. It is a matter of undeniable documented fact. The trial of the Rodenbeck brothers begins on the 14th of March 1891 in the Perry County Courthouse, a modest brick building that has never seen a case of this magnitude. The courtroom is packed with spectators, but the atmosphere is not one of carnival curiosity. It is somber, almost funeral, as though the community itself is on trial for the silence it kept for so long. Judge Whitfield presides, his face carved from stone, his gavel striking the bench with a sound that promises no mercy. The prosecution, led by a young attorney named Harlan Pierce, who has studied the evidence for 3 months, opens with a statement so direct it leaves the room breathless. He tells the jury they will see proof, written and physical, of a crime so systematic and so prolonged that it defies the imagination. He tells them they will hear testimony from the eldest victim herself, and that her words will leave no doubt. Then he lifts the Rodenbeck ledger from the evidence table, holds it above his head and says, "This book is a confession written by men who believed they would never be judged." The prosecution's case unfolds over 6 days, each day more damning than the last. Dr. Galloway takes the stand first. His 12-page report entered into evidence as Exhibit A. He reads sections aloud in his clinical, measured voice, describing the ligature scars on the sisters' ankles and wrists, scars so deep they had become permanent grooves in the flesh. He details the physical condition of the children, naming each congenital defect with medical precision: cleft palates, fused digits, spinal curvatures, cognitive impairments so severe that several children cannot speak or feed themselves. He testifies that these conditions are the direct and predictable result of sustained inbreeding over multiple generations, and that the pattern is so pronounced it could only have been deliberate. When the defense attorney, a court-appointed man named Guillaume, who looks ill throughout the proceedings, attempts to question the certainty of Galloway's conclusions, the doctor produces a chart he created, comparing the Rodenbeck children's deformities to documented medical cases of inbreeding from European royal lines. The similarities are undeniable. Guillaume sits down without further questions. The physical evidence is presented next. The iron chains, still bearing traces of blood, are laid on a table before the jury. The leather cuffs are passed among them so they can feel the weight and see the wear. Justice Thorne takes the stand and describes in meticulous detail the moment the attic door was unbolted, the smell that emerged, and the sight of 3 women who had been kept as breeding stock for decades. He presents his sketches of the attic, his measurements of the chains, and his photographs of the tally wall, 10,000 marks carved by a woman counting the days of her captivity. He reads aloud from his case notes, including the chilling statement made by the youngest sister that it was Tuesday, her scheduled day. The courtroom is silent, except for the sound of weeping from the gallery. Then Thorne opens the Rodenbeck ledger and begins to read. He reads the title page. He reads the entries documenting 6 generations of sibling pairings. He reads the passages describing the sacred duty to preserve the bloodline. He reads the list of 22 children born and 11 who survived, each marked as pure stock or flawed. When he finishes, he closes the book and looks directly at the jury. He says, "This is not madness. This is methodology. This is evil recorded in ink." On the 7th day, Tamar Rodenbeck is called to testify. She enters the courtroom supported by a nurse, her body still frail, her movements slow and uncertain. She is sworn in, and when asked to state her name, she does so in a voice so quiet the judge asks her to speak louder. She repeats it, and then Harlan Pierce begins his questions. He asks her how old she was when the abuse began. She says 20. He asks who established the system. She says her parents, Jedediah and Azuba, before they died, told her and her sisters that it was God's will that they bear children only with their brothers, that any other union would corrupt the bloodline. He asks if the brothers forced compliance. She says yes, with chains and starvation, and the threat that if they refused, the children already born would be taken into the woods and left. Her voice does not waver. She has waited too long to speak to Falter now. Pierce asks her to describe the schedule. She explains that each sister was assigned specific days, that the brothers rotated in a pattern they maintained without fail, that it was as orderly as a church service. The jury members look away, some covering their mouths, but Tamar continues. She says they were never allowed to leave the attic except when pregnant and near delivery, and even then only to the ground floor, never outside. She says she kept the tally marks to remind herself she was still alive, still counting. When Pierce finishes, the defense declines to cross-examine. Guillaume says quietly that he has no questions for this witness. The brothers are given the opportunity to testify in their own defense. Only Silas speaks. He takes the stand with the same calm, empty expression he has worn throughout the trial. He does not deny the facts. He does not claim ignorance or coercion. Instead, he explains in a voice devoid of emotion that his family was chosen by God to remain pure, to resist the corruption of the outside world by keeping their blood untainted. He says they followed the law given to them by their ancestors, a law higher than any court. He describes the children as blessings, the product of sacred unions. He says he has no regret and would do it again if freed, because obedience to divine will is the only true righteousness. When asked if he understands that his sisters suffered, he pauses, then says, "Suffering is the price of purity." The courtroom erupts. Judge Whitfield strikes his gavel repeatedly, calling for order, but the damage is done. Silas has condemned himself with his own words. The jury deliberates for 53 minutes. They return with a verdict of guilty on all counts for all four brothers. Judge Whitfield sentences Silas and Malachi as the eldest and the architects of the continued abuse to death by hanging. Hezekiah and Jubal are sentenced to life imprisonment at the Frankfurt Penitentiary. The brothers show no reaction. They are led from the courtroom in silence. 6 months later, on a cold October morning, Silas and Malachi are hanged in the prison yard. The county records note their deaths with a single line: executions carried out as ordered by law. Hezekiah dies of pneumonia in 1898. Jubal dies in 1911. His body found in his cell, cause listed as heart failure. The 3 sisters and the 11 children are relocated to a private sanatorium in another state, funded by the county and overseen by Dr. Galloway until his own death in 1906. Their location is never made public. 1 year after the trial, the Rodenbeck cabin is found burned to the ground. The fire so complete that only the stone chimney remains. No investigation is opened. The Rodenbeck ledger is sealed by court order and placed in the Kentucky State Archives, where it remains to this day, a testament to the evil that silence protects and justice exposes. The case is closed, the record is complete, and the darkness that lived in Black Mars Holler is finally irrevocably destroyed.